Welcome back. For many members of the TLGBQ+ community, finding a support system can be a challenge. That challenge is heightened for those who identify as trans. Organizations like Destination Tomorrow, a national TLGBQ+ organization, offers a safe space for outcasts to feel surrounded by a chosen family network in a place that offers affirming care and services. Joining me to discuss the TLGBQ+ experience at this time is the founder and executive director of Destination Tomorrow, Ebony Coleman. Sean, thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you so much for having me. I appreciate it.
Now, as I mentioned, this can be a challenge for a lot of people. And I think that a lot of people just assume that members who identify, as being part of the TLGBQ+ community all share the same experience.
Yeah.
Can you just talk about how this can be a huge misconception?
It's like believing that all Black folks share the same experience. Right? I think the only experience that we have in common is a human experience. I think other than that, we're looking at, like, especially with regard to the TLGB community, you're dealing with sexual orientation, gender identity, gender presentation. There's so many other nuances around what it means to identify within that community. And I think a lot of times it all gets conflated into just one thing when it's not necessarily that.
Now, can you talk about the disparities trans people face? Because, as I mentioned, a lot of people, and you mentioned this just now, a lot of people just lump everything together.
Mm-hmm.
What are the disparities people who are trans face?
I think oftentimes folks conflate that whole gender presentation and sexual orientation. When you're dealing with someone who's dealing with a trans identity, they're dealing with their gender presentation. So you'll oftentimes hear folks say, oh, well, you could have just stayed the way you were and been who you were. And it's like, but it's deeper than that, right? It's not just about me identifying as maybe a lesbian or a gay male. It's honestly just who my gender is, what my gender presentation is, or my gender appearance is.
Now, I know a little bit earlier you talked about, the different experiences, and you talked about, like how being Black is a different experience for so many different people.
Mm-hmm.
I wanted to bring up that, that we're currently acknowledging Black History Month.
Yes.
Can you just talk about what this experience is like for Black members of this community?
As someone who identifies as Black and trans, oftentimes I feel erased in both communities, mm-hmm. right? When we're dealing with Black communities, you'll hear the Black communities say things like, oh, the LGBT community, they got it made and they get money and they have support and they have this, when it couldn't be further from the truth when you're looking at Black and brown LGBT or TLGBT folks. So when you have those kinds of comparisons, it's kind of difficult because you don't want to say, well, my oppression is worse than yours, so you have to let me in, or the things that I'm suffering from. But I always want to bring it back to, like, we're all having this human experience, right? So how can we connect rather than disconnect? How do we highlight the things that we have in common and then work towards better, whether it's voting rights, civil rights, trans rights, regardless of what it is, we're all fighting for something. And how do we do it together? Because we have so many things in common.
Now, I want to talk a little bit about intersectionality of, in this case, we're talking about Black History Month, being Black, and then being part of another marginalized community. For those who don't know, how does it feel? You mentioned that sometimes you feel a little bit, erased. Mm-hmm. Can you just expand on that and, how it feels for so many other people?
I can't speak for other people, right? So I'm going to just try to keep it on the experiences I have during this month. I think I recognize a tremendous amount of Black and brown TLGB folks that are doing phenomenal work that you'll never hear of. Right. And then there are those that we may have heard of and you don't understand that their identity was also within this TLGBT or LGB community, like a BxRx, right, who was instrumental in putting together the civil rights movement. So you hear the work that he's done, but you don't oftentimes associate him with being a part of the LGBT community. And I think those are the discussions that we have to have. We have to begin to amplify those heroes that have done substantial work for the community or humanity as a whole and happen to be a part of the LGBT community.
Right. Now, I want to also mention Marsha P. Johnson. Marsha was a Black trans activist in the 1960s. Can you tell me a little bit more about Johnson's story? I heard a little bit about her story myself, but as you mentioned, it's usually like either in one thing, is never like together. So you could just expand on her story a little bit.
Marsha was instrumental in putting together, along with Sylvia Rivera, who I'm sure you've also heard of, putting together this organization called STAR, the Street Transvestite Action Revolutionaries, right? And they believed that they had a place in this gay liberation movement, which is what it was called at the time. But then they also fought for housing and equity, and they wanted to make sure that trans folks had a seat at the table. Transvestites at the time, that was what they were calling themselves, had a seat at the table. And what's ironic is we always bring up those that Marsha's name and Sylvia's name, but we don't talk about how they were ostracized within that community that they were fighting so hard to become a part of, right? At one point, they were booed off stage and banned from attending any gay liberation movements. So that just shows you that even within this culture or subculture, there was still this hesitance to include everyone or have equity for everyone.
Now, I want to talk about, just representation and, the importance of that. Is this a common issue within, activism for the TLGBQ plus community, representation for at least trans individuals?
Well, when it comes to trans folks, I think for a long time we've had other folks tell our stories, right? Like you don't see many Black trans masculine folks, right? Which is why I make it my business to be as visible as possible, because we exist. We have something to say. We do amazing work. And we want to just make sure that we understand that representation matters, visibility matters. So I think it's important that we now step forward and begin to tell our own stories. But at the same time, you have to fight. And I don't want to say fight. We have to angle to figure out a way that we share space, right? I'm not here to take from anyone else or the struggle that I have identified for yourself or your community. What I want to figure out is how do we work together towards those common goals. One of the biggest goals that Marsha was working against was housing, right? And here's 2023, and we're still trying to address housing and safe, affordable housing for folks in the trans community. So how do we move that forward without having this internal strife or struggle?
Now, I want to talk a little bit more about Destination Tomorrow. I think just having the opportunity to speak with you, your organization does some amazing things. Can you just tell us, what programs Destination Tomorrow offers to support trans people?
Well, our programs are for everyone, right? We do an emphasis on trans folks because we have a specialized spot or affinity for folks of the trans community. It's a direct service organization. So economic empowerment is what we're working towards with our community members. So free GED, job readiness, professional development, financial literacy. We want to give folks the tools that they're going to need to be sustainable. And then it's community-centered and community-led, right? So community has come in and said, well, we need to address housing and we need to address food insecurity. And, the Bronx is a dead zone as well. Some households still don't have Wi-Fi or have connection to the internet. So we have now grown into partnership with Grow with Google to work with those who've been criminally impacted in the system. We're doing housing for former or current sex workers who are 25 and over. And we were very specific with 25 and over because the housing as it exists now for TGLB folks are youth and seniors. Oh, wow. After 25, it's just you're on your own. You're going to have to try to figure it out yourself. And we believe that shouldn't be the case. So we've put a housing program in place to kind of work with our community.
Well, I'm really glad that you mentioned that because now that you mention it, it's like, oh yeah, a lot of stuff is, targeted towards youth and sometimes seniors, but there is this gap of people who don't have that support. So thank you so much for mentioning that.
Thank you.
Now, how can members of the LGBT community make sure that they're acknowledging and supporting trans people? As we mentioned that sometimes, there can be trans people can feel outcast within their own community. So what are things that, other people in the community can do to make sure trans people don't feel that way?
It's a few things I think we can begin to do, right? I think you should be intentional with your support, right? So what I mean by that, everyone loves to call themselves an ally, but what does allyship actually look like? And for me, allyship looks like sharing your platform, sharing your space, giving trans folks who have historically not had an opportunity to tell their stories, giving them a space to tell their stories. And then be intentional with your giving, right? So if you are supporting LGBT community or TLGB community, if you're doing that with the purpose of really, really signaling out the trans community, then you have to say that. Because for every $1 that you contribute to an LGBT organization, about 4 cents goes to the trans community. So if you're intentional in your giving, then we're able to kind of support more organizations. And it's so ironic because Destination Tomorrow is also the grant maker in partnership with Gilead Science for the Transcend Community Impact Fund. And what that means is Gilead gives us $1 million every year, and every year we do a national search to find trans and gender nonconforming, non-binary leaders that are doing amazing work but that need the resources, and we gift them between $30,000 and $50,000 a year to help further their mission, because the trans folks exist outside of New York and Miami and LA.
Yeah.
So we look in those rural areas for trans leaders support.
Well, Sean, thank you so much for joining me and just educating, myself and the viewers about this experience. I truly appreciate it.
Thank you so much for having me. I appreciate you.
To learn more about the various programs Destination Tomorrow offers, please go to their website at www.destinationtomorrow.org or follow them on Instagram at destinationtomorrow452. We've come to the end of our show today. I'd like to thank all of our guests for joining us and you, the viewers, for tuning in. If you missed any part of today's show, you can catch the Rita Cable cast at 5 and 10 p.m. on Optimum Channel 67 and Verizon Fios Channel 33, or watch anytime on the web at bronxnet.org. I'm Kibin Alleyne, wishing you and yours safety and wellness now and always. See you next time.